She insulted a Mafia heir in Sicilian, and he decided she belonged to him. Sad the Sari Jidgad. Serena Vale was just as an invisible event coordinator trying to survive another rich wedding until Kyle Moretti mocked her in a language he thought she could understand. One sentence later, she had called him a coward in front of his own men. Most women who embarrassed. The Moretti Heir didn't live long enough to regret it. But Kyle only smiled, because Serena had just become the one thing he couldn't stop watching. Listen up, guys. The night Kyle Moretti locked onto Serena Vale, she was standing under a ridiculously expensive chandelier, totally clueless that a psychological bear trap had just snapped shut. She had just insulted the heir to a criminal syndicate. A basic thug would have pulled a gun. But Kyle, he has the chilling restraint of a true megalomaniac. He just smiled, hit pause for a second. Because 3 weeks from now, Serena is going to wake up in his bed, with blood on her hands, completely eaten alive by Stockholm Syndrome. Today, you and I are going to unpack this disaster, piece by piece, to watch a normal mind get dismantled. The harsh life lesson? Your brain will absolutely normalize a monster if your survival depends on it. This hotel was never a party. It was a hunting ground. Here is the ugly truth about dirty money getting too close to it. Completely rots your sense of reality. Serena had spent the last 6 months rewriting her internal normal, watching corporate guys fuel manic benders and politicians mask absolute sociopathy behind white-toothed smiles. Tonight was supposed to be a breather. Clean money, right? But spoiler alert. There is no clean empire. She stood at the entrance, hugging her tablet to her chest like it was a bulletproof vest against all these insanely entitled guests. She wore that stark black catering uniform, practically begging the universe to let her blend into the wallpaper. But here's a bitter life lesson we all learned too late. The people who try the hardest to be invisible are exactly who a predator spots first. We all do this, right? We play dead and hope the bear walks past. Serena actually believed keeping her head down kept her safe as she navigated through the drunk elites to check a champagne tower. And then she saw him, Kyle Moretti. He was flanked by massive guys projecting pure, terrifying physical threat. But Kyle himself was the black hole in the room. He had that magnetic pull of a supreme narcissist, literally sucking the air out of the space. Those pale, dead eyes, scanning the room like an apex predator, looking for a wounded deer. Serena had read his file, but reading about a psycho is nothing like breathing the same air as one. The biological life lesson here is terrifyingly simple. Your nervous system always recognizes the wolf way before your conscious brain catches up. If you've ever watched a cat play with a mouse, you know that boredom always comes right before the cruelty. Kyle, this untouchable mob prince, was so clearly bored out of his mind. Serena heard his guys talking and instantly recognized that harsh, heavy Sicilian dialect from her childhood. Then, Kyle's voice cuts through the music. He flat out mocks her in his native language, calling her a little girl playing dress-up, totally assuming she is clueless. It absolutely shattered her polite customer service mask. Guys, narcissists use casual humiliation like a radar ping, bouncing insults off you to find your weak spots. The life lesson here is rough but true. Ignoring an insult might keep you physically safe, but it chips away at your soul. She really should have kept walking. Now, the absolute worst thing you can do to a guy with a god complex is puncture his ego. Instead of backing away, Serena steps right into the blast zone. Kyle's bodyguards instantly reach for their jackets. Pure instinct. But Serena doesn't even flinch. She locks dead onto his eyes and drops flawless, rapid-fire Sicilian, totally mocking him for hiding behind his dead father's reputation. The whole room just stops breathing. His guys are ready to end her life right there. But Kyle just barely lifts a finger, and they freeze. He is mentally recalculating what she is. And here's a counterintuitive life lesson. Showing fearlessness to a monster doesn't actually scare them away. It just upgrades you from a random victim to a total obsession. Then, the predator actually smiled. That smile? That isn't a friendly smirk. That is the exact look of a predator who just found a brand new toy. Switching back to perfect, unaccented English, Kyle actually admits he is impressed. Serena is still entirely on the defensive, telling him he needs to find a better hobby than trashing the hotel's staff. One of his massive Varguards mutters something lethal, but Kyle just ignores him. He is completely tunneled in on her now. He demands her name. This is the moment she should have lied. Just make up a fake name, break the thread and run. But she didn't. She gave him the absolute truth, Serena Vale. And guys, the foundational life lesson for surviving this world is simple. Never give a hunter your real coordinates. By handing over her name, she just locked her own cage. The second her boss yelled for her, Serena finally blinked and broke eye contact. That's a physical surrender, by the way. Kyle politely let her walk away, but the brand was already burned into her skin. For the rest of the night, he didn't do anything obvious. He didn't yell or grab her. He just watched. It is this suffocating ambient pressure designed to flood her system with cortisol. He wanted her exhausted. He wanted the sheer terror of being hunted to completely strip away her defenses. It made her so angry, but it also made her heart race in this deeply twisted, confusing way. It's a tragic life lesson, but it is real. The human brain is genuinely terrible at telling the difference between the adrenaline rush of absolute terror and the rush of being desired. So her shift finally ends, and Serena strips off the uniform. She walks out to that massive, dead, empty parking garage. We've all seen this movie, right? This is exactly where the horror drops. She hears the footsteps echo behind her, and her brain immediately slams into fight or flight mode. She slides her car keys between her fingers, like that little piece of metal is going to do anything. Against organized crime, she speeds up. The stalker speeds up. A voice calls her name, and you and I already know it isn't her boss. She turns around and it is one of Kyle's absolute units. The psychological life lesson here is incredibly bitter. We are trained to politely ignore our gut instincts, just so we don't look crazy in public. But that exact politeness is what gets people trapped. She sees the heavy bulge of the gun under his jacket immediately. This is how guys like Kyle operate. They don't do the dirty work. They delegate the terror. The muscle just casually mentions that Mr. Moretti wants to see her. Just like that, all her brave little boundaries are completely smashed. The guy basically tells her that fighting it is useless. Kyle is fixated, and he always gets what he wants. She realizes right then that her self-defense classes mean absolutely nothing against a billionaire's private army. Captivity doesn't start when they lock the door, guys. The real life lesson is that captivity starts the very second you realize your freedom is just an illusion. She let out this broken, hysterical laugh, asked where Kyle was, and just walked into the trap. Let's hit pause and really look at this exact moment together. It is 2 a.m, an empty, echoing, concrete garage. This human brick wall is telling her to get into a car with a mob boss. Every single cell in her body is screaming at her to run for the streetlights. But this horrible, twisted curiosity kicks in. She remembers how Kyle looked at her, not like a human, but like a complex puzzle he wanted to take apart. These guys don't feel love, they only feel ownership. And heaven help her, she wants to know why he chose her. Listen to me. The ultimate life lesson is to never mistake the terrifying pull of the abyss for a safe place to land. She tells the guy she will give him 5 minutes. She walks up to that pitch-black sedan. The steel trap is officially set. Kyle casually tells her to get in. Serena tries to hold the line, telling him they can talk right there on the concrete. Just watch his reaction. It is pure, arrogant amusement. He complains about the freezing wind and drops her first name, instantly forcing this weird, fake intimacy to tear down her defenses. So, she gets in. The heavy armored doors thud shut, and that sound is absolute containment. The massive bodyguard gets in the driver's seat. She is physically boxed in. Before she can even breathe, the car rips away from the curb, diving deep into the city night. She panics and starts yelling, but Kyle just softly tells her he thinks better when the car is moving. She is clutching her car keys so hard, her knuckles bleed. Holding on to a totally useless illusion of safety, she demands to know what he wants. He just turns to her in the dark, and his face has that terrifying, ice-cold symmetry of a true psychopath. He completely ignores her panic and asks where she learned to speak Sicilian. It totally knocks her off balance. She stammers out that an old neighbor taught her the dialect. But when he asks if she learned that insult from the neighbor too, she admits she made that part up herself. That's when the shift happens. He is absolutely fascinated by her nerve. She used an old-world language to disrespect a guy who could end her with a text message. The driver groans, but Kyle literally silences the man with a single look. Pure dominance. Then Kyle laughs, a real laugh, because she isn't a threat. She is just the most entertaining prey in his world. Picture this. We are right in the passenger seat with them. He casually drops the bomb that she just walked into a fatal trap. She throws up her walls, though we can all see she is trapped in a moving car and absolutely terrified. Kyle brushes it off with that classic mobster logic. If I wanted you dead, you would be a ghost already.
Yeah.
She calls him out, but he just tilts his head, studying her like a predator. When she finally admits she is scared, everything shifts. This megalomaniac thrives on control, and now he is hooked. He whispers that grown men cannot even look him in the eye. That brings us to a harsh truth in life. When a dangerous man praises how tough you are, he is usually getting ready to test your limits. He leans in close, completely erasing the space between them. The air in the car gets so thick you could cut it with a knife. She tries to build a wall, speaking formally and demanding to be left alone. His response is a bone-chilling reminder that he has not even offered her anything yet. He looks at her like she is a shiny new toy, admitting he does not know what he wants, but he is going to find out. Suddenly, the brakes squeal. They are parked exactly at her house, a place she never gave him the address to. It is a calculated mental strike to prove he is everywhere. As she scrambles out on shaking legs, she tries one last time to demand her freedom. His reply is quiet, but heavy as lead. Here is a sobering life lesson. You cannot bargain with people who see you as property. They never compromise. They only dictate what happens next. He drops a terrifying promise. He will not cross a single physical line until she literally begs him to. He says it with sick, unshakable confidence. She brushes him off as delusional, but the psychological seed is planted. The car speeds off, leaving her drowning in adrenaline. All night long, her nervous system treats every shadow like a threat. By morning, her exhausted brain tries to convince her it was just a bad dream. But reality is waiting on her porch. A massive bouquet of blood-red roses is sitting at her door, kicking off the aggressive love-bombing phase. Here is a simple life lesson. Over-the-top gestures, early on, are rarely about real romance. Usually, they are highly calculated weapons meant to crush your boundaries, overwhelm your senses, and shatter your feeling of safety. Notice how there is no card with those flowers? That is on purpose. He wants her to feel his invisible presence everywhere. She drags the roses inside, dreading her roommate's questions. Suddenly, her phone buzzes. An anonymous text mocks the exact outfit she is wearing. He is watching her. She blocks the number, but that is useless against a guy who sees boundaries as invitations. Listen up. This is where you and I must see the predator for who he really is. The flower deliveries multiply, invading her job and her home. Movies tell us this relentless pursuit is romantic, but it is actually a psychological siege. Her roommate thinks it is a fairy tale romance, but she knows she is being stalked. The hard lesson here: someone repeatedly ignoring your limits is never showing you love. They are just flexing their power over you. She keeps her terror secret from her roommate, which is a tragic mistake. Isolation is always a captor's best friend. 2 weeks later, the mind games level up. A vintage book of Sicilian poetry shows up. The note attached is classic arrogance. He tells her how she feels, claiming she is only pretending not to be obsessed. She holds out for 3 days before finally cracking. The poetry is chosen to manufacture a fake sense of soulmate connection. She reads the words in the dead of night, drowning in that messy cocktail of shame and dark curiosity. Next, he sends a rare copy of a book she casually mentioned years ago. It is a surgical strike on her fragile emotions. The life lesson here is crucial. Keeping your struggles hidden in the dark only gives your demons the perfect environment to grow stronger. Finding out he dug up obscure details of her past finally snaps her last nerve. The sheer violation triggers a massive emotional explosion. Her anger completely blinds her logic, sending her marching straight into the lion's den. She shows up at his syndicate's exclusive restaurant, demanding to see him. But let us hit pause, because you and I both know a mastermind like this never misses a beat. Within minutes, a massive enforcer steps out. He speaks politely, but you can practically smell the violence on him. He guides her past wealthy diners who are completely clueless about the crime boss operating upstairs. She actually thinks she is taking a bold stand, but she is just walking willfully into his cage. It is a hard life lesson. Never let temporary rage dictate your strategy, or you will end up playing the exact game your enemy wants you to play. Let us open the psychological file on these two. She marches past stolen paintings to reach his guarded back room. Inside, 6 ruthless cartel lieutenants sit around a table. The second she enters, you can hear a pin drop. Kyle sits at the head, casually sipping wine. He is not surprised in the slightest. He is just calculating. Without looking away from her, he tells his men they are done. An older guy tries to argue, but Kyle's dominance simply suffocates the room. The men file out, leaving the lamb locked in with the wolf. He smirks, whispering that he did not expect her to come to him. The mind games are officially in overdrive. Here is the tragic lesson of this entire dynamic. We always think we are smart enough to outplay a dangerous person, but getting too close to that kind of dark power will intoxicate you long before it actually destroys you. She stands there with clenched fists, demanding he stop sending her gifts in a desperate attempt to gain control. Kyle just stares at her and smoothly says, no. She accuses him of playing games, blind to the fact that men like him view human beings as disposable chess pieces. He stands up, moving with the terrifying grace of an apex predator, and casually admits he has been studying her. Stepping into her space, he uses his dark cologne and intense gaze to purposely scramble her brain. Her instincts scream to run, but she is already feeling the twisted pull of a trauma bond. She tells him to leave her alone, but her voice is shaking. He flips the script entirely, framing his stalking as romantic destiny. The real lesson here is chilling. True evil does not shove you into a cage. It slowly tricks you into believing you walked in and locked the door yourself. She uses denial as a shield, insisting she does not even like him. Kyle brutally strips away her reality. He brings up the armed thug who cornered her earlier, spinning the scary encounter as a polite invitation. He casually mentions his men always carry guns, completely normalizing the insane violence of his world. Then he promises she is safe with him, forcing her to rely on his twisted truth, which is textbook gaslighting. When she asks what he wants, he confesses he cannot stop thinking about her, feeding her ego while trapping her mind. Then comes the kicker. He blames her for speaking to Sicilian on day one, shifting the fault of his toxic obsession entirely onto her shoulders. It is a bitter life lesson to swallow. The second you choose to entertain the darkness, you make yourself a permanent target for its watchful gaze. She tries to hold her ground, but his manipulation is relentless. He warns her that she made herself visible, dressing up a terrifying threat as a vulnerable confession. He openly admits his cruelty, using fake honesty to slip past her emotional defenses. He claims that being seen with him makes her a target. Notice the strategy here? He is setting himself up as both the ultimate danger in her life and her only possible protector. When she begs him to stop sending roses, he calmly refuses, keeping her reality completely destabilized. As she retreats, he tells her she knows where to find him when she stops lying to herself, planting the toxic idea that their union is inevitable. Here is a massive life lesson for everyone. When a dangerous person tells you exactly who they are, believe them instantly. There is absolutely zero romance in a monster's gaze. 3 days go by, letting the psychological poison incubate, before everything violently explodes. She is leaving her late shift in a dark garage when two men ambush her. Adrenaline floods her system as her primal brain recognizes the threat. She slides her keys between her knuckles and bravely challenges them. One man smirks and mentions Kyle's name. Instantly, her blood turns to ice. The mobster's sick prophecy is coming true. She fights back hard, striking one man in the eye, and makes a desperate sprint. She barely makes it 10 feet before the second attacker snatches her in an iron grip. She screams and thrashes, but the trap finally snaps shut. This absolute terror is the exact catalyst needed for Kyle's manipulation. It brings us to a very grim life lesson. Toxic predators will happily let other wolves attack you, just so they get the chance to swoop in and play the ultimate savior. The attacker covers her mouth, and the garage plunges into pitch blackness. This sensory deprivation spikes her terror, making her perfectly vulnerable for the trauma bond. Suddenly, slow, measured footsteps echo in the dark. The cold precision of the violence that follows is truly terrifying. A heavy thud hits the concrete. A scream tears through the silence. When the lights flicker back on, Kyle is standing there, looking like the Grim Reaper himself. One attacker is out cold, and the other is on his knees, with Kyle's gun pressed to his skull. Kyle's dead eyes lock onto Serena, scanning her torn jacket. He is not just saving her, he is cementing his role as her omnipotent god. In her total panic, her exhausted brain actually confuses his brutal violence with profound safety. Always remember this brutal life lesson. When a monster is the one who rescues you, the emotional debt is never canceled. It is only delayed. Serena stands paralyzed by shock, while Kyle flips a terrifying switch. We are witnessing the ice-cold emotional control of a textbook megalomaniac. 1 second, his face is pure murder. The next, a chilling calm. He presses a gun to the attacker's skull, extracts the name Salvatore Viscari, and his men drag the guy away. The garage goes dead silent. Kyle turns to Serena, moving like a wolf cornering a deer. She begs to go home, but his sick pathology kicks in. He instantly strips her of all choice, declaring her apartment compromised and trapping her in his web. And here is the brutal irony. We often think being shielded keeps us alive, but true safety is never found by surrendering your free will to someone who thrives on absolute control. Let us hit pause and look at this moment together. Kyle holds out his hand, revealing the scarred knuckles of a violent offender. Every alarm bell in Serena's head screams at her to run. But panic takes a toll, and sheer exhaustion hijacks her rational brain. In a tragic precursor to Stockholm Syndrome, she seeks comfort from the exact monster who endangered her. She places her shaking hand in his. He drives her 20 miles away to a heavily fortified estate. Those giant stone walls and iron gates perfectly mirror the psychological cage he is building. As the heavy gates slam shut, the grim reality of her choice sets in. You and I need to remember this truth. Exhaustion often masquerades as consent, pushing us across heavy boundaries we can never easily uncross. This estate is a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The manor reeks of wealth and inescapable surveillance, establishing Kyle as the absolute god of this domain. When Serena questions her captivity, Kyle uses a smooth micromanipulation, gently stroking her knuckles to breed dependency. He feeds her the classic lie that this isolation is purely for her safety. Inside, his staff anticipates her needs, silently eroding her independence. He guides her through the halls, making obsessive possession look like supportive care. The sheer opulence of marble and crystal is deployed to overwhelm her exhausted mind. The life lesson here is devastating but completely true. Material grandeur is frequently used as a gilded cage, carefully designed to make a person blind to their own sudden captivity. Beneath that sterile wealth lie the markers of an active predator, the scent of tobacco, a discarded jacket. Leading her past ancestral portraits, he asserts absolute dominance. He places her in a guest room with zero timeline for release. When pushed, Kyle deflects, using the rival threat of Viscari as a trump card. This is how a narcissist weaponizes outside danger to justify control. Serena tries to anchor herself, logically stating she means nothing to him. His response is a chilling physical violation. He lightly traces her jawline, staking a tactile claim. His quiet dismissal of her logic reveals a terrifying reality about fixation. To the obsessed mind, the victim's perspective simply does not exist. The lesson here is profound. You can never logically reason your way out of someone else's dangerous delusion. The moment they are interrupted, Kyle's psychology switches gears. His simulated warmth evaporates, replaced by the dead, flat effect of a killer. Serena's reaction here is a wild study in cognitive dissonance. Logically, she should want this man to suffer. But watching her captor embrace his brutal nature sends her into severe anxiety. Kyle openly validates his violent side, a manipulation meant to force her to accept his darkness. He orders her to rest, dressing up his control as care, while he goes to spill blood in her name. Here is where the trauma bond shows its most disturbing symptom. His cold certainty does not send her running. It gives her a twisted, sickening sense of security. We must face a harsh truth about human survival. Seeking shelter in the shadows of a monster only guarantees your own eventual destruction. Let us examine the mechanics of her confinement. The quarters are designed to pacify the victim, using extreme luxury. The amenities act as tools to overwhelm her nervous system with comfort. She steps into the shower, desperately trying to scrub away the somatic memory of the assault, standing until the water runs cold. When she steps out, she finds fresh clothes, tailored perfectly to her exact measurements. This detail is clinically terrifying, proving premeditated surveillance. Kyle mapped her dimensions long before the abduction. Serena consciously suppresses this horrifying truth, diving into profound psychological denial. She tells herself she will depart at dawn, a pathetic lie her own subconscious already recognizes. The life lesson is deeply unsettling. Comfort is frequently the most effective weapon used to silently crush our natural instinct to escape. Waking up is the hardest part. Serena experiences brief amnesia before traumatic memories flood back. She sees frantic messages from her friend, Maya. Here is an agonizing symptom of captivity. Serena helps build her own cage by lying to Maya, effectively severing her only lifeline. She walks into the kitchen and finds Kyle playing house. He pours coffee in casual clothes, a calculated performance of normality, meant to mask his violent reality. But the proof remains visible on his freshly split knuckles. Serena actively chooses willful blindness, ignoring the physical evidence of his brutality. When she asks about the previous night, his clinical dismissal of human life is absolute. The crucial life lesson here is about complicity. When we actively lie to cover up the darkness surrounding us, we become the silent architects of our own prison. You and I need to carefully unpack this interaction. Kyle casually explains the territorial dispute, painting Serena as a pawn in a violent chess match. His rival correctly identified her as Kyle's singular vulnerability. When Serena challenges this irrational obsession, Kyle reveals the rigid mindset of a true narcissist. His fixation needs no logical foundation. His obsession simply exists as absolute law. Serena tears herself apart inside. Her rational brain begs her to label his behavior as a mere cocktail of adrenaline and proximity. But the trauma bond is already rewiring her emotional circuits, creating an addictive tension every time their eyes lock. We must understand a vital truth about human nature. The greatest danger is not the physical threat itself, but our brain's terrifying capacity to eventually romanticize the very thing that traps us. Serena makes a desperate push to reclaim her autonomy, demanding to go home. Kyle countered her with an arbitrary 3-day timeline, a psychological trick to pacify a captive with a false horizon. When she rejects his conditions, his twisted paternal control crystallizes. He completely revokes her decision-making privileges. Serena calls it exactly what it is, kidnapping. But Kyle uses extreme rationalization, rebranding his forced imprisonment as necessary protection. He steps into her personal space, using physical proximity, to dominate while speaking in tones of gentle reassurance. He shifts the blame for her captivity entirely onto his rival, absolving himself of guilt. The psychological lesson hits hard here. When a person strips away your freedom under the guise of keeping you safe, they are not your protector. They have simply become your new warden. Watch how this trap completely snaps shut. You are staying here where I can keep you safe. Kyle dictates, executing the final isolation phase of Stockholm Syndrome. By removing her from her familiar world, he forces himself to be her sole source of security. Serena tries to cling to reality. Then Kyle drops a beautifully manufactured glimpse of remorse. "You deserve better," he whispers. That calculated vulnerability binds a victim deeply. Just as he almost touches her face, an enforcer interrupts. Viscari, the rival boss, has called an 8 o'clock meeting and demands Kyle attend completely alone. The atmosphere instantly shifts to an existential threat. It is a blatant, undeniable trap. The lesson we observe from this scene is absolutely chilling. In a brutal ecosystem of apex predators, showing even a single second of hesitation is an immediate death sentence. Kyle processes this ambush with the freezing detachment of a high-functioning sociopath. He agrees to the meeting, but orders sniper coverage. For him, violence is just a logistical equation. Serena, tethered to normal human empathy, watches in absolute horror. "You are walking into a trap," she warns. He casually sips his coffee, explaining that avoiding it signals weakness to the cartel. He will gamble his life just to preserve his tyrannical image. His casual relationship with mortality infuriates her, yet it deepens her psychological dependency. When he asks if his potential death bothers her, he is directly testing the trauma bond. She desperately wants to lie. To claim this mobster means absolutely nothing. But her emotional walls are already collapsing. Note this carefully. Normal human morality is incredibly fragile when it is exposed to absolute conviction. Let us just hit pause right here. You and I are watching the exact moment a person completely surrenders her survival instincts, and it is wild. Serena tells him it bothers her, thinking she is making a stand, but Kyle just looks at her like a wolf, cornering a lamb. He touches her face, whispering that he is not done with her yet. She pretends to resist, begging him for no empty promises. But the fight is gone. He claims he always keeps his promises, leaving her in that giant mansion with a pounding heart. She wanders around, touching dusty pianos and old books, basically measuring the drapes of her own cage. It is a tough pill to swallow. But here is the lesson. The absolute hardest prison to break out of is the one where you fall in love with the guy holding the keys. Seriously, look at her right now. If anyone else were locked in a mafia state, they would be breaking windows and dialing 911. But Serena just jiggles a locked door and shrugs. It is that terrifying apathy that sets in when your brain just gives up. She wanders out to these massive, creepy gardens, complete with a weeping angel fountain that practically screams bad omen. Instead of planning a great escape, she sits on a cold stone bench, genuinely stressing out over the violent mob boss who kidnapped her. Think about how tragic that is. Sometimes we completely abandon our own safety just to fix someone else who is broken. Then, out of nowhere, the camera pans. Standing right behind her is this older woman, Maria, watching Serena with the cold, dead eyes of a shark. So here comes Maria, calmly holding pruning shears, like she does not work for a literal crime syndicate. When she assumes Serena is the new girlfriend, Serena gets all flushed and defensive, which is basically a neon sign saying yes. Maria drops a massive emotional bomb, casually mentioning that Kyle's mom planted these exact roses before she died of cancer when he was just 12. And boom, there it is, the tragic backstory. Suddenly, Kyle is not a cold-blooded killer anymore. He is just a sad little boy who lost his mom. Serena instantly starts making excuses for him, convincing herself that his violent streak is just a shield. Guys, the real tragedy here is how fast our brains will rewrite a monster into a victim, just so we do not have to be terrified of them anymore. Watch how smooth this manipulation is. Maria actually convinces Serena that being allowed to walk outside in a garden is some grand romantic gesture. They just stand there, clipping roses, while Serena forgets She is basically a hostage. Maria drops this incredibly raw line, telling her that Kyle might be a good man, but he is definitely not a safe one. She tells the girl to run while she still can. But let us be honest, the time for running is long gone. Serena just sits there, completely frozen, wondering if her captor would even let her walk out the door. It breaks your heart because we have all been there in some way. The brutal lesson here is that the longer you sit around justifying someone else's toxic behavior, the harder it becomes to finally save yourself. Maria practically spells out her doom, warning her that getting tangled up in this mafia life leaves scars you can never erase. But watch what happens when night falls and Kyle rolls out with his heavily armed crew. Serena does not try to escape. Instead, she paces her fancy room for hours, totally paralyzed, checking the clock like a worried wife. When those black SUVs finally pull back in at 1:30 in the morning, her reaction is pure madness. Kyle walks through that front door, literally covered in the blood of another human being. Any normal person would be screaming and running for the hills. But Serena? She actually feels relief. It is terrifying how trauma twists your mind, making you run straight into the arms of the exact nightmare you should be running away from. Let us pause on this final crushing frame. Serena stops inches from a guy who literally reeks of fresh blood and gunpowder. Kyle just flat out confesses he murdered his rival, Viscari, and he did it for one simple reason. The guy touched her. Kyle is standing there, blending absolute psycho-violence with twisted, protective love, telling her it should make her sick to look at him. He is giving her an out, but he knows exactly what he is doing. He knows she is hooked. By all laws of nature, she should throw up and bolt. Instead, she just closes the gap and wraps her arms around a confessed killer. Two broken people, finding comfort in the dark. The hardest truth in life is that sometimes we will accept the darkest kind of love, just so we do not have to be alone. Let us hit pause right here and look at Kyle. Starved for human touch, he snaps and pulls Serena into a desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair like a drowning man. You and I are going to break this down together, because it shows how a trauma bond starts. In that hallway, suffocating on the smell of dead roses and fresh blood, Serena seals her fate. She locks onto a narcissist who kills without blinking, just to protect his possessions. When he steps away to wash the blood off his hands, she panics. She begs to talk, but he orders her to wait. It is a brutal trick to keep control. The life lesson here is harsh but true. People will often ignore for the most terrifying lags calls. As long as the monster holding on them promises, they will never have to be alone again. Did you catch that little physical anchor? A single tap on her hip before he leaves, just to keep her emotionally chained. 40 minutes later, he walks into the library. The blood is gone, but the room instantly turns freezing cold. He sits down and calmly drops a bomb. He is engaged to the daughter of Don Vittorio Bellicaro, the ultimate apex predator of the European underworld. He delivers this nightmare with zero emotion, purely to knock Serena off balance. Then comes the masterstroke. He declares he will break a massive 3-year mafia pact and claims he is doing it all for her. The guilt crushes her. She actually begs him not to ruin his life. The sad truth we must all learn is this: never take the blame when a toxic person burns their own world to the ground. They were always going to strike the match. They just needed you to hold the gasoline. Kyle cranks up the torture by framing this not as a canceled wedding, but a full-blown declaration of war. Stick with me here, because the psychology is brilliant. Serena tries to shrink herself, crying that she is just some random girl. So Kyle pulls out his heaviest weapon. He steps into her briefcase and drops the word love. He praises her trauma response, admiring how she never flinched when they first met. It is textbook love bombing. He feeds her deepest craving to matter, making her feel like the only woman on earth. It breaks your heart to watch, because here is the harsh reality of life. True monsters do not actually fall in love with you. They simply scan your soul, locate your deepest, most painful vulnerability, and build a beautiful golden cage customized to fit it perfectly. Now he paints these fake pictures, talking about planting a rose garden just to see her smile. It is a spectacular lie to hide his killer instincts. He wipes away her tear, an act of physical dominance disguised as comfort. He claims losing her is worse than a cartel war. And right there, Serena completely surrenders. She breaks down, admitting that while she hates his violence, she feels perfectly safe with him. It makes you want to scream at the screen. This brings us to a painful life lesson. A broken mind will cling to the very poison that is destroying it. If that poison promises to act as a shield against the rest of the world, he presses his forehead against hers and whispers for her to be terrified with him. He is dragging her into his dark, paranoid bunker and locking the door from the inside. They silently agree to drive off a cliff together. Then comes the kiss. Let us be real, there is zero actual affection here. It is raw territorial claiming. The moment tastes like adrenaline and danger, pushing them past a boundary you cannot walk back from. When he asks her to stay the night, it is not a request, it is a contract with no return clause. You and I have probably made this mistake in smaller ways, right? Trading our hard-earned peace for the cheap thrill of chaos. Serena throws away her safe life for a maniac who treats her like a trophy worth starting a gang war over. It is gutting to watch. Here is the vital lesson. Never let your desperation to be valued cause you to mistake predatory obsession for true love. She tosses every single survival instinct straight out the window. She blindly walks down a hallway decorated with dead cartel bosses. A literal museum of sociopaths, leading right to his bed. Serena, a woman who used to run from danger, completely erases her identity for him. Then morning hits, and daylight always ruins the fantasy. Her bruised lips are physical proof she handed over her power. Yet, the second he pulls her to his chest, her brain floods with oxytocin, destroying her logic. He asks if she regrets it, just a sick test to ensure she is still hooked. They try to lie there and pretend the outside world is gone. Then a phone starts vibrating on the nightstand, totally shattering their twisted little bubble. The final life lesson here is undefeated. You can lock the doors and close the curtains, but you can never hide from the brutal consequences of your choices. He finally picks up the phone, and just like that, the sweet boyfriend mask melts right off his face. We literally see his eyes harden into pure, lethal ice. The Bellicaro family knows the engagement is off, and Don Vittorio is demanding a sit-down immediately. For the very first time, we see real, raw panic in Kyle's eyes, and Serena catches it too. Stick with me here, because this is where a control freak's perfectly built lie completely collapses. He flat out tells her that picking her just put a giant target on her back. The pure terror finally hits Serena, her breathing going totally out of control. She's trapped. And honestly, the lesson here is brutal. You can never build a safe life on top of someone else's dangerous secrets. Kyle orders her to stay locked inside the compound, using that classic abuser move of calling a cage a safe house. He actually thinks he can go face down a ruthless mafia boss and walk away. He grabs her face, making this desperate, pathetic promise to fix a completely broken situation, kissing her like he is trying to brand her before he leaves. As she watches him put back on his mobster armor, something inside Serena just shatters forever. She finally gets it. The harsh truth of life is that ignoring the red flags doesn't make them disappear. It just wraps them around your neck. She is pacing the floor, completely trapped by her dependence on a guy who just willingly walked right into a meat grinder. By the time the sun goes down, her nerves are absolutely shredded. She is glued to the window, begging the universe for him to come back. But those headlights rolling up don't belong to Kyle. 6 black cars smash through the gates. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? This is the exact moment his massive ego ruins everything. A guard grabs her arm, screaming about an attack. Suddenly, it is pure chaos. Gunshots, glass raining down everywhere. Serena hits the floor, curling into a ball while people are dying around her. Then, dead silence. Just the slow, terrifying click of dress shoes on marble. Don Vittorio steps into the room, cold as a grave. Life teaches us that arrogant pride always invites destruction. Now we get to look at a totally different kind of monster. Don Vittorio stares her down like she is a bug on a windshield. He gives this freezing little smile, actually asking out loud if Kyle is really willing to die for her. The guy looks like a sweet, silver-haired grandpa going out for Sunday coffee. But it is entirely a mask for 40 years of pure murder. The contrast is just sickening. You have this gorgeous marble floor absolutely covered in blood, and one of Kyle's men lying dead with his head caved in. Serena goes completely blanking, her brain just pulling the plug to survive the trauma. The simplest life lesson you will ever learn is that monsters rarely look like monsters. They usually look like the nicest guy in the room. Just listen to the absolute disgust in Vittorio's voice when he tells her to get on her feet. He has these dead-eyed young thugs flanking him, guys who have clearly had their souls completely hollowed out by the mob. The old man circles Serena, treating her like cheap meat at a butcher shop, openly mocking her face and her body. But here is the real trigger for him. He wants to know how a nobody broke his master plan. To this guy, his own flesh and blood daughter is just a chess piece, bred to secure a business merger. He can't even compute that Kyle chose real feelings over his shiny mob princess. It's a tough lesson, folks. When you treat people like property, you will never understand the power of actual human connection. The absolute hatred rolling off this guy is suffocating. Pinned to the wall, Serena desperately explains she only survived by swearing at Kyle in his own language, and Kyle actually liked it. Vittorio just gives this empty, bone-chilling laugh. He tells her marriage is a business transaction. Period. Then he grabs her face so hard the bruises instantly bloom on her jaw. He's not heartbroken for his daughter, guys. He's just embarrassed. 3 years of careful planning ruined, and he looks weak in front of the families. In his twisted reality, an insult requires a body bag. He whispers that she is going to be his bloody warning. True life lesson here. Sometimes the worst violence comes from a tiny, fragile male ego. With one little nod, all her choices are gone. Her pure survival instinct finally kicks in, and she makes a run for it. But come on, it is totally useless against trained killers. A massive guy snatches her up like a rag doll. She is kicking and screaming, and Vittorio just tells them to gag her because her crying is annoying him. Can you imagine being that emotionally dead? They jam a rough cloth in her mouth and drag her out. Through the broken doors, she sees the housekeeper, Maria, standing there frozen in terror, hands covered in dirt, just totally broken by years of looking the other way. Then they toss Serena into a heavy SUV that smells like expensive leather and gunpowder. The sad truth is, staying silent around evil eventually makes you a prisoner to it. That gag is cutting right into the corners of her mouth, and the zip ties are biting so hard. Her fingers lose all feeling. Vittorio just slides into the front seat, lights a cigarette, and leaves the dead bodies behind like trash. He tells the driver to head to Kyle's old warehouse to make a poetic point. You and I are watching a textbook narcissist put on a theatrical show right now. It's all about marking his territory. The goon next to Serena is just casually scrolling on his phone while she is suffocating in panic. She knows the absolute worst part. Kyle has no idea she is gone. The drive takes 20 minutes into an empty industrial wasteland. A tough pill to swallow is that sometimes pure isolation is the weapon that destroys you first. The cars park outside this massive, rotting building covered in rust and busted glass. Vittorio steps out and strips his back like he just arrived at a luxury golf resort instead of a torture chamber. He tells them to drag her inside and call Kyle, demanding he shows up completely alone. They pull her into this pitch black, heavy room. A couple of cheap fluorescent lights flicker on, showing absolutely nothing but one steel chair bolted to the concrete. Serena's heart basically stops. The floor under the chair is stained black with old blood. They strap her ankles and chest down so tight she can barely pull in a breath. When they finally rip the gag out, she gasps, her throat completely raw. Life rule number 1, never walk blindly into the dark. Just because someone told you it was safe. Vittorio pulls up a cheap folding chair, crossing his legs like they are having coffee. He asks her if she knows the history of this room, his voice totally dead. She shakes her head. He tells her a guy named Viscari was tortured and shot in the head right there. By Kyle, just 3 days ago. Vittorio smiles, this sick little smile. He loves the sick irony that Kyle killed for her here, and now she will die here because of him. Then he drops the ultimate trap. He offers her a choice. If she wants to live, she has to look Kyle in the eyes, tell him she never loved him, and break his spirit so badly he runs back to Isabella. He is turning her into the weapon that ruins her own life. The bitter lesson here is that manipulative people will always force you to pull the trigger on yourself. Not a single muscle moves on Vittorio's face. He tells her the alternative is that she refuses, and he makes Kyle watch while they torture her to death. That threat hits her like a brick. She calls him insane, but he just calls it practical. Let's examine this closely together. It's the ultimate psychological trap. Break your own heart, or die horribly, and destroy his soul forever. He stands up, brushing off his expensive suit, giving her 30 minutes to think about it, before Kyle shows up. He walks away into the dark. But Serena has been counting every single second in her head since they grabbed her. She knows she doesn't have 30 minutes. She only has 18. And the craziest truth of all? Time is the one thing you can't negotiate with, no matter how much you beg. All right, let us hit pause right here and look at this scene together. The heavy roar of an engine shatters the silence, followed by the heavy thud of a car door. Kyle steps into this grim lighting, completely alone. Serena sees him, and her heart just breaks. This is the tragic irony of her life, finding absolute comfort in the hands of a violent predator. Kyle is dressed in all black, looking ready to burn the city down, but the second his eyes find her, his tough armor cracks. He whispers her name, losing his cold control. Then Vittorio steps out, slow clapping like a classic villain. Kyle immediately offers to surrender to the arranged marriage, just to get her back. But Vittorio gives this icy smile. The lesson here is simple. True love is not about grand romantic gestures. It is about being willing to hand your worst enemies the knife, just to keep someone else safe. Vittorio treats Serena like a prop, telling Kyle he wants him broken. Kyle steps up, and suddenly every gun in the room is pointed right at his chest. He threatens to wipe out Vittorio's whole family line, but the old man just pulls out a silver pistol. The guy is a pure narcissist who craves total submission. He tells Kyle to get on his knees, agree to the marriage, and pay a $10 million fine. Kyle does not even blink. He says yes to all of it and drops right into a puddle of blood on the concrete. Serena is begging him to stop, but he snaps at her to stay quiet. She is absolutely horrified, watching the deadliest guy she knows willingly throw away his power just for her. It teaches us something deep. The strongest people in your life are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who will willingly drop into the dirt, just to make sure you can keep standing. Vittorio is not done twisting the knife. He orders Kyle to beg. Kyle strains his voice, offering money, territory, even his own life, just to let her go. Serena is crying silently, her emotions completely wrecked. Vittorio walks right up and presses the cold barrel of his gun straight to Kyle's head, whispering that love just makes you powerless. He pulls the trigger. A loud, empty click echoes in the room. Kyle does not even flinch. He just stares dead ahead. Vittorio laughs and turns his weapon towards Serena, calling her a loose end. But instantly, Kyle explodes off the floor. At that exact second, smoke canisters crash through the shattered windows, filling the room with blinding gray gas. Here is the reality check. People who mock the love of others usually end up blinding themselves to the very real danger standing right in front of them. Stick with me, because this is where the whole power dynamic flips on its head. Familiar hands grab Serena through the thick smoke. It is Kyle, telling her he has got her. He cuts her loose and moves through the blind apple crossfire like a predator who can see in the dark, dropping her safely behind an armored car with his family crest on it. She stammers that he promised to come alone. Kyle gives this terrifying, adrenaline-fueled smile and says he lied. Why would he ever walk into a trap without his crew? He vanishes back into the chaos. The takedown inside is brutally precise. 2 minutes later, the gunfire stops. Kyle walks out of the fog, covered in blood, dragging a beaten Vittorio by the collar. He drops the ruined old man right at her feet. The takeaway: never mistake someone's willingness to suffer for an inability to fight back. Look at how the tables have turned. Don Vittorio is choking on his own blood, yet he is still trying to play mind games and goad his attacker. Kyle responds by slamming the old man into the pavement. Once, twice, but he purposefully leaves him breathing. Why? Because the absolute worst thing you can do to a narcissist is let them live with public humiliation. Kyle orders his men to drag the body away as a warning to everyone else. Then, in a split second, Kyle goes from a cold-blooded killer to a totally broken man. He pulls Serena against his chest, apologizing frantically. We see the exact moment his tough exterior shatters. She just holds him, whispering that he saved her. It is a harsh truth, but sometimes the people who create the most chaos in the world, are the only ones capable of making you feel completely safe in the middle of it. They are standing there holding each other in a room, absolutely covered in shell casings and devastation. Kyle gives her a warning that sounds more like a twisted promise. He tells her that a life with him means constant danger, endless paranoia, and unavoidable violence. Any normal, healthy person would take that cue and run for the hills. But this is where the trauma bond locks in. Serena does not see a monster covered in blood. She sees the man who kept her alive. The blood does not scare her away. It pulls her closer. When she accepts this dark reality, you can see this fierce, desperate relief in his eyes. They kiss, and it is not sweet or romantic. It is desperate, tasting like iron and sheer survival. Here is the lesson we all have to swallow. Trauma does not just break people. It binds them together in ways that logic can never pull apart. You and I both know this decision comes with a massive price. Kyle completely calls off the arranged marriage, severing his ties with the Bellicaro family for good. When Serena asks about the gang war this will cause, he is chillingly calm. He just says they will win. The drive back to his estate is a masterclass in deep paranoia. He switches cars, loops around, and uses every trick to shake off anyone watching them. Serena is so exhausted from the adrenaline drop that she just rests her head on his shoulder. By the time the sun comes up and they reach the compound, you can see the brutal toll this life takes. The mansion is covered in bullet holes and shattered glass. It reminds us of a hard truth. Our external environment always ends up reflecting our internal chaos, no matter how much money we spend trying to hide it. Let us take a look at the immediate aftermath. Kyle's crew is already scrubbing the crime scene, literally washing away the horrors of the night. He walks her past the reinforced gates and locks them both inside a secure room. Right here, his dominant mob boss act just crumbles to pieces. He stares at her face with this intense, obsessive fear, terrified by how close he came to losing her. He actually admits that his own arrogant pride almost got her killed. His mind is spinning with anxiety about future attacks, but Serena stops him. She pulls him back to the present moment. She acknowledges the nightmare they are in, but flat out refuses to run away. It shows us that true loyalty is not about pretending the fear does not exist. It is about looking at the worst possible scenario and choosing to stay anyway. In this twist world, intimacy is their only survival mechanism. They check each other for cuts and bruises, documenting the physical toll of the night. Kyle finally admits he cannot control himself anymore. He is hopelessly in love with her. Serena feels the same way, even though she knows she is destroying his entire empire. She justifies it by tying her own self-worth to his violence. In her mind, if a man is willing to burn down the city for her, it means she is valuable. Outside their locked door, you can hear the horrifying sounds of hammers boarding up windows. It is the ticking clock of an unavoidable gang war. The painful lesson here is that tying your value to how much destruction someone will cause for you is a dangerous game. When violence becomes your love language, The only guarantee is that someone is going to bleed. She sleeps for 8 hours, her body finally crashing from the trauma. When she wakes up, she is completely alone and disoriented. Almost immediately, she hears loud, angry voices coming from downstairs. She throws on some oversized clothes and creeps toward the noise. We need to really listen to this argument. A loyal capo is screaming at Kyle, telling him that shooting Vittorio was tactical suicide, and the Bellicaro family will demand revenge. But Kyle is suffering from pure tunnel vision. He bluntly states that his actions were meant to punish, to teach his enemies what happens when they cross him. He is throwing away a 3-year priestry just to keep her. It is a stark reminder for all of us. When obsession takes the steering wheel, logic gets thrown right out the window, and you will gladly crash your own car just to prove a point. The tension in the room absolutely shatters when a capo calls Kyle out, telling him he is acting like an impulsive animal instead of a boss. Kyle instantly defaults to what he knows best, pure violence. He threatens to throw the guy straight through the window if he speaks another word. The whole room goes dead silent. Serena is watching all of this from the stairs, seeing 5 hardened criminals struggling to control the monster they call their leader. Then the oldest capo tries to reason with him, asking if they are going to pay for this mess with money or with blood. Kyle looks him dead in the eye and says he will burn his entire criminal empire to the ground if it means keeping her. Here is the bitter truth about power. All the money and influence in the world mean absolutely nothing if you are entirely enslaved by your own unchecked emotions. We are watching a man completely erase his own legacy. Kyle rejects everything his father built, outright refusing to use an arranged marriage to keep the peace. His men try a different angle, carefully explaining that they respect his authority, but his thinking is totally flawed. They point out the obvious. Serena is a civilian. She does not belong in this brutal life, and risking hundreds of loyal men for a 3-week romance is madness. Kyle simply shuts them down, refusing to hear any logic. As the men walk out, that oldest capo looks up and locks eyes with Serena. His face is this chilling mixture of deep pity and absolute disgust, and that is the final lesson. You might think you are the hero of a beautiful romance, but to the innocent people forced to pay the price for it, you are just the disaster that ruined everything. Let's hit pause right here and look at this absolute mess together. We are watching the classic isolation phase of a trauma bond unfold in real time. The muscle leaves the room, and suddenly it is just Teresa and Kyle. Look at his body language. His hands are buried in his pockets, his shoulders rigid as a board. That is the physical manifestation of a guy completely losing his grip. He is practically begging her to tell him he is not crazy for throwing away a 3-year mafia peace treaty just for her. And Serena? She is questioning her own worth, wondering if she is just his shiny new obsession because she dared to say no to him. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson for you. When you start worrying more about your kidnapper's feelings than your own physical safety, the psychological trap has already snapped shut entirely. Notice the words Kyle uses here. Acting like losing her is the exact same thing as drowning. That is a visceral panic response, completely exposing that he uses her as his only emotional oxygen. When Serena says she is going to share in his fatal mistake, her voice literally cracks. Boom. That is the bedrock of Stockholm Syndrome right there. She is linking her own survival to the exact guy who put a target on her back. Today, you and I are going to unpack this destructive synergy together. They are holding each other tight while the whole estate is gearing up for a bloodbath, completely ignoring the reality outside that door. And Kyle's grand plan? He wants to parade her right in front of Don Vittorio and demand she is untouchable. The lesson is clear. Arrogance will always try to rewrite the rules, but it usually just gets everyone killed. Now, Serena's first instinct is totally spot on. She knows they are walking into a meat grinder, but Kyle tries to spin this suicide mission as a power move, hoping the old man will respect his guts. What a massive miscalculation. Vittorio is a monster who feeds on ego. He does not respect boldness. He only crushes defiance. Kyle is dragging her right back into her nightmare, forcing her to relive the warehouse, the bolted chair, and the blood on the floor. It hits hard, doesn't it? Here is a hard life lesson we all have to learn. The constant, creeping fear of violence actually eats away at your soul, faster and deeper than the violence itself. Kyle picks neutral ground, betting that a public spot will keep them safe. Serena says she is terrified, but look at her eyes. The trauma has already burned out her ability to feel normal fear. This whole scene is a masterclass in how people break and rebuild themselves under pressure. Look at Serena going through a total mental reset. As Kyle holds her, her brain briefly hits the mute button on her panic. But the tension is suffocating. She is locked inside a fortress of steel and loaded guns. Then he tells her to bury every natural human reaction, making her stare into the mirror until her terror hardens into ice. It is a brutal thing to watch. It forces you and I to realize a really uncomfortable truth about life and survival. Sometimes, just to make it through the absolute worst storms, you have to completely murder the person you used to be. She is shedding her old skin, not because she wants to, but because if she shows even a drop of weakness, these wolves will tear her apart in a matter of seconds. Fast forward 24 hours, and she looks like a completely different person. The dark clothes, the cold stare. It is all a desperate camouflage to blend into a room full of killers. Kyle looks at her like he owns her, totally proving how sick their bond really is. He offers her a fake way out, knowing damn well she is completely trapped in his web and would never leave. Then he pulls her close, marking his territory, getting her adrenaline pumping so she stays loyal to him. Honestly, this is the darkest part of manipulation. The lesson here is that the person pulling the strings will actually use love and affection as a weapon, making sure you walk yourself right up to the firing line with a smile on your face. It is a tragedy dressed up as romance, and both of them are completely blind to the trap they are in. Stick with me here, because this car ride is where the tension becomes unbearable. They are walking past their own armed guards, and Serena's body is screaming at her to run. Her heart is pounding, and she is terrified of what this sadistic rival boss is going to do to them. But instead of panicking, she flips the script in her head, telling herself this terror is actually true love. It is the exact same twisted logic we see with Vittorio's men. They think dying for a mob boss is some kind of noble honor. It teaches us a very simple life lesson. The human mind will literally invent any fantasy to avoid dealing with a horrific reality. They finally pull up to a place named after something beautiful, totally ignoring the ugly, bloody mess that is waiting for them behind those doors. The irony of it all is just suffocating. The front of this building looks totally normal, right? Just a quiet spot to keep the cops away. But Serena is not fooled for a single second. She instantly spots the cameras, the hidden guns, and the fact that nobody else is around. Kyle starts giving her these tiny signals on how to stand and look tough, and she immediately puts on a fake mask of total dominance to hide her shaking hands. Then they walk past Vittorio's main hitters. These guys have those dead, empty eyes, the kind of guys who do not lose a second of sleep over pulling the trigger. It is a sobering reminder and a lesson for all of us. The real monsters in this world do not walk around screaming and waving their arms. They stand perfectly still in the shadows, looking like it is just another ordinary Tuesday at the office, waiting to strike when you blink. Let's hit pause again and look at how this room is set up. It is all about intimidation. Up there at the head of the table sits Don Vittorio. He is practically falling apart from a recent gunshot wound, but his eyes are burning with pure hatred. The man is a textbook narcissist. His body is failing him, so he desperately needs to crush someone to feel powerful again. He zeroes right in on Serena, choosing the weakest person in the room to unleash his anger on. Kyle just sits there, cold as ice, refusing to let his heart rate spike. Then Vittorio starts laughing, spitting up blood in the process. It is pathetic, really. Here is a lesson about power. These men will literally burn the world down just to stay on top. clinging to their violent little kingdoms even while their own bodies rot away from the inside out. Now Vittorio starts listing off his dead men, but do not be fooled for a second. He does not care about them at all. He is just mad. His pride took a hit. He is throwing a tantrum, totally willing to let his whole empire crash and burn just to make Kyle suffer. When his son Marco tries to talk some sense into him, the old man just gets louder, throwing garbage insults at Serena to make her feel like nothing. Kyle instantly tenses up, ready to explode, but Serena grabs his hand to keep him grounded. It is completely insane when you think about it. Kyle is demanding respect for a woman he literally dragged into a death trap. Here is a hard life lesson about pride. In a world run by massive egos, someone feeling slightly insulted is 1,000,000 times more dangerous than someone who just lost a loved one. Egos start wars. You and I can see exactly where this whole negotiation goes off a cliff. Marco steps in, trying to be the adult in the room and fixes with cash and deals. But for a guy like Vittorio, it is never about the money. He wants Kyle to grovel. He demands Kyle honor an old arranged marriage, basically telling Serena she is garbage. Kyle refuses and grabs her hand right on the table. It is a massive slap in the face to the old man. Kyle offers him money, territory, whatever he wants, thinking logic will win. He is so wrong. Vittorio forces himself to stand up, fighting through agonizing pain, and you just know it is over. The lesson is simple but brutal. You can never use logic to talk down a bruised ego. When a man is acting purely out of pride, any kind of compromise feels like a fatal knife in his back. The old man basically hands down a death sentence and turns to walk away. But right here, everything changes. Serena actually speaks up. Her brain is screaming at her to play dead, but she fights through it. She admits she is a nobody from nowhere, totally disarming him with the brutal truth. Then she flips the script, claiming she owns Kyle's loyalty, in a way Vittorio never could. The old mobster laughs it off, saying love means nothing in their world. But Serena nails him to the wall, telling him his whole empire is just fear, dressed up as loyalty. It is absolute suicide, but it is brilliant. The life lesson here is powerful. Never underestimate a person who has nothing left to lose. When you strip away all their power, they will use your own ugly secrets as a weapon and stab you right in the heart with them. Let's hit pause right here, because we are watching a masterclass in how not to handle a narcissistic mob boss. Serena just dropped the ultimate psychological truth bomb on Vittorio, laying out exactly how Kyle will burn the world down to keep her. But she completely missed the point. You never threaten a man who thinks he is a god. When Vittorio flashes that chilling little smile, that is the look of a predator entirely divorced from morality. He orders her death like he is ordering a coffee. Marco goes for his gun. Kyle throws his body into the line of fire, and the illusion of negotiation is permanently shattered. The harsh life lesson we all need to understand here. You can never use logic to talk a monster out of being a monster once they have already chosen violence. Picture this scene unfolding on the big screen. The alleyway ambush is pure, suffocating chaos. Gunfire explodes, and Serena's brain completely shuts down, her body defaulting to a terrified crouch, while Kyle physically drags her towards safety. The air is thick with the bitter smell of gunpowder, the kind of scent that will haunt her nightmares forever. They hit the cold night air just as their getaway car gets blown wide open. Vittorio's goons swarm them like predators smelling blood. Kyle fights back with the lethal grace of a lifelong hitman, but it is just simple math: too many guns, not enough time. Seeing Kyle take a bullet and collapse completely breaks Serena. Our life lesson for today? True terror isn't just facing death, it is watching your only safe space vanish. Today, you and I are going to unpack a textbook example of a trauma bond. And trust me, it is not pretty. Look at Serena. She is running on raw panic right now, her brain hijacked by fear, as she drags Kyle's bleeding frame into the getaway car. She throws herself into the back seat, hands trembling as hot blood slips through her fingers. She is screaming that there is too much blood, completely falling apart. But Kyle? Even with a bullet in him, his mobster paranoia runs the show. He absolutely refuses a hospital, ordering his men to speed to his private estate and call in a shady underground doctor. In the middle of all this extreme violence, we find a very simple life lesson. Crisis will always strip away our polite masks and reveal who we are truly attached to at our core. The getaway car swerves violently through the dark streets. Serena presses down on his wound with everything she has, but the bleeding is disastrous. Kyle looks terrifyingly pale, like a ghost already crossing over. She is sobbing, begging him to keep his eyes open. He weakly grabs her hand, whispering a pathetic apology for failing to keep her safe. She snaps right back at him, crying that he literally just took a bullet for her. His laugh turns into a sickening, bloody cough. After an agonizing ride, his guards drag his unconscious body into a bedroom, where Dr. Chen is waiting with surgical tools. It brings us to a grim life lesson. When absolute terror takes over, a trauma bond will twist your reality, making the exact person who dragged you into danger feel like you're home. Dr. Chen demands everyone clear the room. Serena plants her feet and refuses to move, showing the defiance of someone who cannot lose their anchor. The doctor operates with cold detachment while Kyle drifts in a painful haze. When Chen declares him lucky because the bullet missed major organs, Serena lets out a bitter laugh. The doctor bluntly states that luck is relative in their brutal world, ordering 6 weeks of bed rest. Kyle wakes up and tries to play the tough mob boss, rejecting the order. Unfazed, the doctor reminds him that his crown means absolutely nothing if he bleeds out. It is a simple life lesson we all eventually face. All the power and control in the world is just a fragile illusion the second our physical bodies decide to fail us, driven by a manic need to stay in charge. Kyle tries to force himself up, but a vicious spike of pain shoves him back down. The doctor gives it to him straight: stay in bed, or rip your stitches open. Serena grips his hand, begging him to rest. The hardened mobster looks at her terrified face, swallows his raging ego, and closes his eyes. Before leaving, the doctor drops a chilling observation. He treated Kyle's ruthless father and has never seen Kyle look at anyone with such vulnerable obsession. Serena collapses into a chair, numb to her ruined, bloody clothes. There is a profound life lesson in her frozen stare. When you anchor your entire survival to one flawed person, keeping their heart beating becomes your only purpose in life. Her nervous system is totally fried. She literally cannot let go of his hand. Outside, you can hear the terrifying sounds of a mob war waking up shouted orders, revving engines, guns clicking. Vittorio has turned a simple sit-down into a bloodbath. Serena presses her head against Kyle's feverish skin, drowning in crushing guilt. But Kyle's eyes snap open, sharp as glass. He shuts down her pity party instantly. He tells her he knew exactly what taking her would cost, and he would gladly pay that bloody price again. He strokes her hand, bathing in his twisted victory because she is still his. It brings us to a deeply unsettling life lesson. A toxic mind never runs away from destruction. It uses all that chaos to justify its most extreme and dangerous attachments. Let's watch this dynamic flip. Kyle promises to end the violence with the terrifying confidence of an apex predator. Serena's logical brain knows it is a lie, but her trauma bond forces her to believe him. For 12 suffocating hours, they are trapped in a room, smelling of copper and sweat. Kyle is in pure agony, thrashing from feverish night terrors. Serena fully embraces the caregiver role, pushing painkillers and wiping his brow. By dawn, his fever breaks, and his first instinct is to get up and return to the war. So Serena does something shocking. She forcefully shoves the dangerous mobster right back into the pillows. It highlights a fascinating life lesson. Sometimes the only way to save a deeply destructive person is to become the one immovable object they simply cannot control. His brain refuses to shut down, demanding his men enter for a war council. Serena crosses her arms, transforming from scared hostage into his warden. Reminding him of the bullet he took, she demands he stay in bed. The violent mobster actually glitches. His intense aggression melts into a quiet, obedient state. Sitting on the mattress, She leans in. He reaches up, tracing her face like she is the only real thing left in the world. He confesses his fear, and she tries to take the blame for the bloody ambush. He sternly refuses to let her carry that guilt. We learn a vital life lesson from this tragic scene. Shared trauma has a terrifying way of creating an unbreakable delusion of safety, even when your entire world is actively burning down. Kyle lays out the brutal reality with chilling calmness. Vittorio is foaming with rage, and a massive assault is coming. But then, Kyle does something shocking. He offers Serena a clean, untraceable new identity, miles away from the syndicate. Logically, she should be sprinting for the door. But her Stockholm Syndrome is set in stone. She violently rejects the offer, refusing to leave him behind to face the guns alone. Kyle completely breaks, torn between the selfish relief of keeping her and the crushing dread that his world will kill her. He pulls her down, kissing her, like the world is ending in 5 minutes. Here is the brutal life lesson we must swallow. Love forged under the constant threat of death will completely destroy your natural instinct to survive. Stick with me, because you and I are going to look at this next move together, and it is absolute madness. Kyle schemes to play the neutral crime families against Vittorio. He wants to walk right into a major mob summit in Philadelphia and expose Vittorio as an unhinged narcissist who is terrible for business. Serena goes pale. He is literally planning to walk unarmed into a room packed with apex predators who would probably just shoot him to avoid a gang war. Kyle looks her dead in the eye and admits the plan is functionally insane, but gripping her hand, he insists it is the only card they have left to play. It all boils down to a truly terrifying life lesson. Sometimes, the absolute only way to defeat a monster is to stop running and step directly into its waiting jaws. As the reality of the summit sets in, Kyle actually blinks first, suggesting they liquidate everything and run like ghosts. It is a desperate grab for control. But watch Serena in this moment. She looks at the dried blood under her fingernails, thinks about a lifetime of running, and makes her final choice. She chooses war. She states that taking a bullet next to him is better than breathing without him. It is the absolute peak of trauma bonding. Hearing that, Kyle emotionally short-circuits, dragging her against his chest to hold his own shattered mind together. He sets a 72-hour clock for their final play. She forces her tears down, locking away the very real odds that they will both be dead by Friday. The final life lesson. When love becomes a trauma response, going down with the sinking ship feels like the absolute ultimate victory. Pause the movie right here. Look at Serena convincing herself that dragging each other to the grave is somehow romantic. It is the ultimate coping mechanism. For the next 3 days, this estate turns into a pressure cooker of paranoia. Kyle is bleeding through his bandages, running a mob empire from a mattress. Meanwhile, Serena realizes Vittorio is a methodical parasite who needs to own everything he touches. Kyle's late father ruled with ice-cold math, but Kyle is pure, chaotic emotion, trying to build a cartel on something as fragile as loyalty. Here is a quiet truth to remember. Building a life on volatile emotions is just building your own beautiful guillotine. Both of them are desperately trying to survive a war they cannot win. So Kyle is gambling his existence on trust, which is laughable in a room full of sociopaths. Serena watches him prep and asks if the other families have his back. Kyle gives her this heartbreaking, dead-eyed look. He knows the rivals only care about their own pockets. If he shows any weakness, they will let Vittorio eat him alive. His only strategy is puffing up his chest so the other monsters get scared. But then Serena brings up love, and you can literally see the agony crush Kyle's face. He admits his love is the exact poison killing her. He is drowning in survivor's guilt, wishing he could have kept her safe in a normal life. The hardest lesson you can learn is that sometimes loving someone fiercely is the exact same thing as destroying them. This is the moment Serena completely crosses the point of no return. She looks at the safety of a normal life and spits in its face, choosing the meat grinder as long as Kyle is holding her hand. It is tragic how quickly the human heart adapts to absolute hell just to avoid being entirely alone. Kyle pulls her in close, letting his desperate grip say all the things his mouth cannot. They sit in the dark, spinning this pathetic fantasy that pure logic will somehow stop a madman like Vittorio. It breaks my heart watching Kyle stroke her hair, pretending they have a real shot, when he knows the math is screaming that they are already dead. We all do this, do we not? We build comfortable lies in the dark, because facing the terrifying truth of our own fragility is just too heavy a burden to carry. The camera pans to Manhattan, and the game begins on supposedly neutral ground. Look at how they dress for the slaughter. Kyle slides into his dark suit, hiding the stitches ripping in his side. Serena slips into a gorgeous gown that is basically a psychological bulletproof vest. Kyle hands her a heavy diamond. You and I have both made this tragic mistake, throwing a shiny object at a problem, hoping it hold back the doom. Serena takes it silently, aware that a rock cannot stop a bullet. As their convoy rolls through the city, Serena zones out, watching the streetlights blur. The lesson here is simple, but brutal. When reality gets far too agonizing to survive, the human mind simply packs up its bags and leaves the building entirely. We arrive at a gorgeous brownstone, which is really just a fancy wrapper hiding decades of rot and murder. Serena grips Kyle's hand so tightly her knuckles are white. They are walking up the stairs to their own execution, and the dread is thick enough to choke on. The heavy doors swing open into a dim conference room, and the food chain is instantly established. 5 ruthless mob bosses sit there, guys who move billions in blood money without blinking. At the head of the table is Old Man Romano, the apex predator of this miserable jungle. He is just waiting Kyle up for letting his emotions run the show. It proves a bitter truth. No matter how high you climb in life, there is always someone older and much colder waiting quietly to tear you back down to earth. We are locked inside this boardroom where monsters negotiate. Syndicate heavies flank the room, and directly across sits Vittorio. His shoulder is packed with bandages, but his eyes are boiling with toxic ego. Romano flashes a terrifyingly fake smile and asks them to sit. Serena sits stiff as a board, locking her trauma away just to survive the hour. That massive door clicks shut, sealing their tomb. Romano instantly cuts to the chase about the brewing war, and Vittorio starts screaming about Kyle having absolutely no honor. It is painfully ironic to watch a snake complain about fairness, and here is a bitter truth we must all accept. The loudest voices demanding honor in this world are usually the exact same people hiding a very sharp knife right behind your back. Watch Kyle try to keep his cool. He looks these killers in the eye and claims he chose love over mob duty. Vittorio instantly loses his mind. The guy is a massive narcissist, so any loss of control is an attack on his ego. He calls Kyle weak, which is ironic since Vittorio wants a bloodbath just because his pride is hurt. Serena is in the crossfire, hyperventilating as the bosses demand she be erased to fix the alliance. But look under the table. Kyle grabs her hand, and her panic magically melts. It is incredibly tragic to witness. She is clinging for safety to the exact man who dragged her into this death trap. It teaches us a grim lesson. We frequently seek our comfort from the very hands that broke us in the first place. And it is almost always a fatal mistake. The Boston boss mocks Kyle for risking a war over one woman, but Kyle is playing chess. He smoothly offers $10 million, prime Brooklyn real estate, and a public apology. He will surrender anything but Serena. Vittorio instantly twists the knife by bringing up Kyle's dead father. That is what tyrants do. They weaponize your deepest grief. But Kyle does not flinch. He flips the script, warning the room that Vittorio will happily burn their shared profits over a personal grudge. Kyle brilliantly uses their own greed against them, painting Vittorio as a totally unstable liability rather than a respected boss. The lesson here is powerful. If you want to defeat a monster, do not try to match his raw strength. Just expose his emotional instability to the people holding the purse strings. Let us unpack this power play together, shall we? Romano nods at Kyle's logic and Vittorio's fragile ego completely shatters. The old snake stands up, demanding loyalty, trapped in a childish mindset where everyone is either his puppet or his mortal enemy. But Romano shuts him down, threatening to cut Vittorio off from the syndicate entirely. Take away a narcissist's audience, and they suffocate. The sheer terror of total abandonment forces Vittorio to sit back down. It is a masterclass in taming a beast. Romano bumps the fine to 15 million and demands an apology, tossing Vittorio just enough respect to keep him from pulling a gun while completely removing his fangs. True power never has to shout. It simply redraws the boundaries while the loudmouths tire themselves out. Vittorio spits at the deal to protect his bruised ego, but Romano ignores him, imposing a 5-year peace treaty. Vittorio points at Serena, probing for a loophole to hurt Kyle, but Romano declares her off-limits. Beside Kyle, Serena's heart is beating so fast it might break her ribs. The most agonizing lesson in life is realizing your fate is sometimes controlled by people who do not care if you breathe. The vote passes, boxing Vittorio in. Look at his face flushing purple, his fists trembling with toxic rage. His bruised ego is screaming at him to start shooting, but the heavy peer pressure forces him to choke it down. He quietly accepts the terms, but do not be fooled for a second. A suppressed fire never actually dies. It just burns under the floorboards until it brings the entire house down. The tension breaks, and Serena nearly passes out as the adrenaline crashes out of her system. It is sickening watching these men pivot into casual small talk, ignoring that they just gambled with human lives. Romano gives them 3 days for the cash. But Vittorio cannot let it go. He slithers over to whisper a promise of destruction to Kyle. That is how a narcissist repairs his ego, by fantasizing about your ruin. Kyle stares back, promising a shallow grave. Serena hides behind Kyle, deeply convinced that her captor is her savior. Vittorio flashes a bone-chilling smile before walking out. Let this be a permanent warning for your own life. Malicious people do not actually know how to forgive a perceived insult. They only know how to patiently wait for their turn to strike back. Listen up, guys, because this is where the human brain does some truly wild mental gymnastics. Romano tries to hype Kyle up using his dead father, but Kyle is not having it. He knows he is breaking the survival handbook to play house with Serena. When the crew clears out, the sheer emptiness of their toxic bubble hits you. Serena looks at the exact guy who ruined her life and asks if she is safe now. Kyle drops the hammer. Vittorio will never stop hunting them. As Kyle pulls her close, Serena just accepts it. She is signing up for a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. Her survival instinct is gone, replaced by a fatal dependency. It teaches us a tough life lesson. The most dangerous cages we will ever find ourselves in are the ones we willingly lock ourselves inside. Serena actually looks this man in the eyes and chooses him over her own freedom. This is the peak of Stockholm Syndrome. She mistakes a trauma bond for epic romance, completely blind to the fact that he is a walking death sentence. They are trying to play pretend in a room that reeks of gunpowder. But fate loves a cruel joke, and reality shatters the mood the second Kyle's phone buzzes. 3 of his guys just got wiped out. Instantly, Kyle shifts gears. In his world, if you bleed, the sharks circle, so he has to retaliate brutally. Instead of running for the hills, Serena actually begs to ride straight into the slaughter. It leaves you with a grim life lesson. When you ignore all the bright red flags, you eventually start believing the fire is just there to keep you warm. Kyle shuts that idea down fast, snapping right back into warden mode to control her every move. And Serena's argument? She literally lists her past kidnappings like they are a resume for a promotion. It is completely heartbreaking. The violence has become so normal that she uses her victimhood as VIP access to his dark world. Kyle plays the protector, insisting she hide in his fortress. He uses a soft touch to manipulate her right back into her cage, and she folds. As Kyle rolls out with his crew, moving like a pack of starving wolves, Serena is left standing in total, suffocating silence. The level of self-delusion it takes for her to survive here is truly staggering. Here is the life lesson. If you let someone else write the story of your life, they will always cast you as the prisoner. So she gets shipped back to her fancy prison, haunted by the memory of blood and Vittorio's sick little grin. She is stuck waiting for the other shoe to drop. But watch closely as she pulls up to the gates. The craziest psychological flip happens right here. She realizes she is not afraid of the bad guys anymore. The only thing terrifying her now is the thought of losing the guy who locked her up in the first place. That is the point of no return. She has soaked up the poison around her and decides she will be just as deadly as the hitmen hunting them. If Kyle dies, she swears she will burn the city to ash. The life lesson here is chillingly simple. If you drown a person in enough trauma, they do not just shatter. They eventually adapt into the exact monster they used to run from. Let us pause for a second, because you and I are going to unpack this twisted evolution together. What started as a desperate trauma bond has mutated into a full-blown sickness. Loving an apex predator like Kyle has completely rewired her brain. She looks at her hands and realizes she is fully capable of murder. She sits by that window, staring at the empty driveway, making a terrifying promise. If he does not walk through those doors, she will finish the bloodbath with her own 2 hands. Love is not a feeling for her anymore. It is a loaded weapon. The tragic life lesson here is one we all need to hear. Whenever we compromise our morals just to survive a bad situation, we risk losing the best parts of our humanity in the process. The headlights never show, and her phone stays silent. Fast forward to 7 in the morning, and her nerves are fried. She is running on pure cortisol, hands shaking like a leaf. 16 unreturned calls. For a girl with her trauma, that is 16 separate heart attacks. Just as she is about to start calling the morgues, tires finally crunch on the gravel. Serena practically flies down those stairs. The heavy oak door swings open, but it is not the romantic reunion she wanted. 3 of Kyle's hitters stumble inside, looking like they crawled out of a meat grinder. Kyle is not with them. She screams for him, completely losing her grip. Carlo gives her this empty stare. He tells her Kyle took a bullet but refused to leave until every enemy was dead. The life lesson is blunt. Loyalty to destructive people will only ever reward you with pure agony. Her vision just zeroes out. You can see the pure shock hit her system. She demands Carlo take care to it right now. Carlo tries to be the voice of reason, but her twisted attachment completely bulldozes over any normal human survival instinct. That 20-minute ride to the docks is a masterclass in irony. Look at the people out the window drinking lattes, living totally normal lives, completely blind to the fact that a war zone is bleeding into their streets. When they pull up, the docks look like a slaughterhouse. Bullet holes everywhere, tarps thrown over the losers, and right in the middle of this absolute nightmare stands Kyle. His face is painted in blood, but the crazy bastard is breathing. It teaches a vital life lesson. Chasing chaos will always blind you to the beauty of a quiet, ordinary life. The car is not even fully parked before she kicks the door open and sprints. Kyle spins around, eyes wide, with pure, unfiltered rage. He starts screaming at her for leaving the safe house, but she just crashes into him like a wrecking ball, not caring about the blood or the dead guys 10 feet away. She whispers that he promised to come back, begging him to validate her devotion. And just like that, the Mafia kingpin melts. He softens up, swearing that the rival crew forced his hand, but that they are all dead now. He promises it is over. But guys, look at her face. She asks the one question that breaks your heart. Is it really? It is a brutal life lesson for all of us. You absolutely cannot build a peaceful, secure future on top of a messy foundation of buried secrets and broken bodies. Let us take a step back and really look at the damage here. We are watching the ultimate toxic trap snap shut. Kyle uses total isolation to convince her that his bloody reality is the only one left. Look at how she reaches up to touch his bleeding cut. It is a textbook tragic move, the victim trying to comfort the very monster who dragged her into hell. They are literally hugging each other. They are literally hugging each other while dead bodies are cooling off on the pavement around them. It is absolute madness. She demands they face the mob together, completely normalizing the slaughterhouse. You and I have seen people justify some crazy things for love, but this is next level. The sad life lesson is this. If you force yourself to tolerate the presence of darkness every day, eventually your eyes adjust and you forget the light entirely. For the next 3 weeks, things go weirdly quiet, which is honestly the most terrifying part. Don Vittorio completely falls off the radar. Inside the compound walls, Kyle's bullet wounds turn into scars, and Serena starts playing house in the rose gardens like this is a normal suburban life. But watch her eyes. She is constantly scanning. She is counting the sniper drills on the roof, timing the sketchy midnight deliveries, just waiting for the explosion. She knows deep down they are just sitting in the eye of a very bloody hurricane. But she is clinging to this fake domestic bliss like a life raft. It offers a heartbreaking life lesson we cannot ignore. Whenever you choose to live inside a predator's den, temporary silence never means you are actually safe. It just means the monster is regrouping. This is where her isolation becomes complete. She is waking up in his bed, drinking her morning coffee, lying to herself that her biggest problem is just how much she loves him. She methodically cuts every single tie she has to the real world. She feeds her best friend Maya some garbage story and basically sets fire to her old life. And the crazy part? She does not regret it, not even when she wakes up screaming from nightmares. Because Kyle is always right there, playing the hero, whispering sweet nothings until her panicked brain believes she is safe. But that beautiful little illusion shatters into a million pieces the second the phone rings. It leaves us with a stark life lesson. You can burn all your bridges to hide from reality, but the truth will always find a way to knock on your front door. She cannot help herself. The danger just pulls her right to the door. Kyle is barking into the receiver, spitting fire and saying, Vittorio never hands over an olive branch unless there is a blade taped to it. Hearing Vittorio's name makes Serena freeze completely solid. She slowly walks in. Kyle practically breaks the phone, slamming it down. When she asks what the old boss wants, you can see the absolute exhaustion in Kyle's bones. Vittorio wants a private sit-down to hash out a permanent truce. Serena instantly knows it is a deadly trap, but Kyle actually bites. He tells her it might be their only ticket out of this paranoid nightmare. It hits you right there. The core life lesson is undeniable. Even the most dangerous apex predators eventually get entirely exhausted by the endless burden of survival. Let's pause right here, guys. Kyle is exhausted from constantly looking over his shoulder, and he's sick of watching Serena flinch at every slammed door. She points out the glaring insanity of meeting an enemy who actively wants to put him in the ground. But Kyle? He casually calls it a calculated risk. Men of violence always convince themselves they can micromanage a hurricane. Serena wants to scream because she knows his math is broken. But here is the bitter irony. She is so blinded by this twisted bond that she only sees the heavy burden he carries. When she hears the sit-down is tomorrow night, all logic vanishes. She steps right into his space, using his own promises of partnership as a weapon. She is not asking for a permission slip. She is telling him she is coming. She drops a massive ultimatum. They ride together, or nobody goes. You can see the gears grinding in Kyle's head, trying to figure out how to keep her safe. He finally caves, but lays down the law. She stays in the car, and if bullets fly, she runs. She kisses him just to shut up his nervous rambling. Kyle mutters that she is going to be the death of him, and Serena coldly swears she will kill anyone who tries. The craziest part of this dynamic is that Kyle actually laughs. She reminds him she learned from the best. That final kiss they share tastes exactly like a permanent goodbye. They finally arrive at the meetup, a hollowed-out construction site in Queens. It is a massive concrete shell, the absolute perfect dead zone to make bodies disappear forever. Serena's instincts are screaming the second they pull up. They roll in with a dozen armed guys, proving Kyle is sweating. Vittorio's trucks are already parked in a half circle, dominating the space. Kyle leaves her in the car with a guard named Carlo and steps out. Through the dark glass, Serena watches the standoff unfold. Out walks Vittorio, acting like he owns the earth. You can almost feel the tension bleeding through the screen. The bosses meet in the middle. Serena cannot hear a word, but she reads their body language perfectly. Kyle is stiff and defensive, while Vittorio glows with predatory confidence. Neither guy is backing down an inch. She warns Carlo they are walking into a trap, but the clueless guard just mindlessly repeats his blind, brainwashed loyalty. Then she sees it. A flash of metal on the roof, a sniper. Every rational thought in her brain vaporizes. She screams, fighting off the guard, and runs toward the danger. Kyle turns around just as the rifle cracks, and he goes down hard. Listen up, guys. Extreme trauma does awful things to memory. For Serena, the world shatters into pieces. Bullets fly from every direction. The guard drags her behind a car as the terrible smell of gunpowder fills the air. She fights him like a wild animal, driven by a desperate need to know if Kyle is still breathing. When the guard's grip slips, her survival instinct completely flips backwards. She breaks free and sprints right through a wall of flying lead. She reaches Kyle just in time to see a massive dark stain spreading across his chest. Kyle's eyes lock onto hers. He is choking on his own breath, begging her to run. She refuses, hopelessly trying to drag his bleeding body out of the open. One of his guys hauls him behind a concrete block just as bullets shred the ground they were standing on. Kyle coughs up frothy blood, a brutal sign that his lung is punctured. Serena presses her hands against the wound, her fingers slick with his blood, begging him to stay awake. He gives her a pathetic apology, realizing how blindly he walked into this trap. Serena uses her anger as a shield. She tells him to shut up, furiously forbidding him from dying. He manages a weak, fading smile. All around them, the gunfire is absolutely deafening. Vittorio played them perfectly. Kyle's crew is hopelessly trapped in a meat grinder. Vittorio twisted their hope for peace into a flawless trap. A guard yells to move Kyle, but Serena sees the truth. His skin is turning blue. Moving him will kill him. This is where the madness of her trauma bond takes over. She puts her hands up and walks right into the open. Her unexpected surrender makes the shooting stop. Vittorio steps forward, soaking up the moment like an arrogant king. Despite her terror, Serena's voice is steady. She offers a simple trade: take her life. Let Kyle live. Vittorio laughs, mocking her for having no leverage, but she knows exactly how to hit his fatal spot. She reminds this egomaniac that killing Kyle will spark a massive street war, utterly destroying his precious peace treaty. She steps forward, stealing the power right out of his hands. She spells it out. Let Kyle live, blame the shootout on rogue gunmen, and keep your power while executing me for revenge. Vittorio asks why she would throw her life away for a monster. Her answer is the tragic rock bottom of her trauma. Vittorio smiles, loving the idea of Kyle waking up to find her dead. He points the gun right at her chest. She closes her eyes, ready to die. A massive gunshot echoes through the yard. But she feels absolutely nothing. She opens her eyes to the craziest twist of the century. Vittorio is staring at a huge hole in his own chest. His arrogant brain cannot even process his own death before he drops to the dirt. You and I must recognize one simple lesson here. In this brutal world, the most dangerous variable is never the loaded weapon. It is always the human heart. Let's pause and look at Marco. He is standing right over his father's bleeding body, holding the smoking gun, looking completely bored. It is chilling. Marco diagnosed his dad's biggest problem with ruthless perfection. The old man's massive ego was terrible for business. By putting a bullet in his own father, Marco instantly crowns himself the new king. He loudly declares the peace treaty is back on, shutting down the chaotic mess his dad created. You look around, and all these hardened criminals are completely frozen, staring at this brand new apex predator. It is a brilliant, totally sick move, and it proves one of the darkest truths about people. In the underworld, loyalty has absolutely nothing to do with love or family ties. It is driven entirely by the cold, ugly mechanics of staying alive. Watch what Marco does next. He steps right over his dad's dead body without even looking down. It is the ultimate display of zero attachment. He casually tells his guys to get Kyle to a hospital, deciding the debt is settled. As the rival gang packs up, we swing back to Serena. It is rough to watch. She is in the back of the car, holding Kyle's bleeding head in her lap, sobbing. This is the man who dragged her into this nightmare, and she's holding him together while he bleeds out. Their panicked whispering shows exactly how sick their connection is. She is hopelessly chained to the guy ruining her life. This teaches us a truly grim lesson. Extreme trauma can hammer psychological chains so deeply into our brains that we actually mistake the heavy, freezing iron for a warm, loving embrace. The nurses pry her hands off him at the surgical doors, leaving her in shock, covered in his blood. What happens over the next 8 hours is wild. We watch the underworld turn a hospital waiting room into a mafia boardroom. Marco sends slick lawyers to draw up peace terms while Kyle is getting his chest cracked open. When the staff tries to kick Serena out, the mobsters just hand them thick stacks of cash to look the other way. Money buys silence. By the time the doctor says Kyle is going to live, Serena's nervous system is totally shattered. The lesson here is absolutely brutal. In a world where morality always has a price tag, human grief is never something to be respected. It is just another annoying problem that needs to be managed. The jump to the sterile recovery room hits hard. Kyle is strapped to monitors, looking totally helpless without his guns. Serena's reaction proves exactly how addicted to him she is. She stands over his unconscious body, demanding he wake up so they can build a fantasy life together. 3 days later, his eyes finally open. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Serena completely breaks down. Her voice cracks as she confesses how terrified she was. And Kyle? He just hits her with his usual practice charm and a weak apology. We learn something crucial right here. The absolute most dangerous predators are not scary when they are bleeding in a hospital bed. They look pathetic, weak, and broken. And that is exactly what makes them impossible for their victims to walk away from. The second Kyle's brain clears, he is back in mob boss mode. When told Vittorio got smoked by his own kid, Kyle barely blinks, typical sociopath. Serena is still trapped in survival mode, terrified of everything. Then Kyle pulls off his biggest scam yet. He uses his injury to act like he has seen the light. He blames his violent empire on his father, swearing he is choosing her over the mob. You and I are going to look at this together and see the plain truth. The guy is not changing. Real change takes years of hard work, not just surviving a single bullet. He is spinning a fantasy because he knows she will buy it. A predator never actually stops being a predator. They just learn how to wear a sweeter, softer mask so you invite them inside. Let's hit pause right here, guys, because we are watching a wild example of emotional hostage-taking. Kyle isn't just proposing. He's locking the cage and making Serena thank him for it. He tells her he's stepping back from the blood, serving it up like some noble sacrifice. Her brain is so cooked from the trauma, she eats it up. He takes his biggest red flag, the fact that his lifestyle almost killed her, and uses it as the very reason they need to be permanently chained together. He dresses up a lifetime of paranoia as epic romance. It's absolutely horrifying to watch. But here's the brutal life lesson we all need to remember. When the monster hands you the keys to your own cell, it's not freedom. It just means he knows. He's finally moved the lock inside your head. Now watch how he seals the deal with this fake domestic fantasy. Serena is crying tears of joy, which is the absolute tragic peak of Stockholm Syndrome. She's kissing the architect of her nightmare, surrounded by hospital monitors that are only beeping because of him. They sit there giggling about buying massive diamond rings with blood money, totally convinced they've magically escaped the mob life. Stick with me, we're about to see how this movie actually plays out, and the reality doesn't match their delusion. You can just walk away from a body count. The life lesson here is a bitter pill. Any peace you try to build on top of unhealed trauma isn't a real cure. It's just a temporary remission, holding its breath until the inevitable, violent relapse kicks the door down. Let's take a hard look at the fallout. You and I both know the golden rule. Predators do not change their stripes. Yet here is Serena, surviving a war zone, only to get taken out by a lethal dose of optimism. Kyle struts out of the hospital, ignoring his doctors. But crazy enough, something shifts. He starts handing off the dirty work, dropping the paranoia that kept him alive. Within a week, he drops a fortune on a ring. Serena watches this and actually believes her devotion fixed his broken brain. It's such a human trap. The life lesson is heartbreaking. We desperately want to believe our love is strong enough to heal a damaged soul, completely ignoring the fact that this exact same soul has already left a massive trail of shattered lives in its wake. This wedding guest list is absolute comedy, mixed with pure terror. You've got 50 hand-picked guests, all capable of burying a body, temporarily agreeing not to shoot the groom. Even his rival, Marco, sends vintage wine as a mobster peace treaty. Serena wears white, though she argued it felt like a sick joke over her stained conscience. But Kyle wasn't having it. To him, she's a flawless trophy. He tells her she deserves everything, completely ignoring their shared trauma. They literally say vows in a rose garden planted over decades of mob hits. And that kiss? He doesn't just kiss her. He swallows her whole. The life lesson? Putting a beautiful white dress on a nightmare doesn't make it a fairy tale. It just makes you completely blind to the bloody dirt you are standing in. The reception is a wild mix of high-class catering and heavily armed goons standing by the champagne. But nobody fires a shot. As the party fades, Kyle pulls Serena into the garden, safely away from the mobster glare. They holding hands, and he drops the big question. Are you happy? Her answer hits like a ton of bricks. She admits she is absolutely terrified. That's the tragedy of chronic trauma. When your brain is wired to expect a bullet, total silence feels like a bomb waiting to go off. She's scared it's all a fragile illusion. Kyle promises nothing will ever touch their peace, completely high on his own god complex. But here is the brutal life lesson. Fate always delivers. The monsters we think we finally outrun almost never stay buried for good. Stick with me here, because this is where the story completely flips. Kyle looks at her with scary conviction. He tells her it's just them, and the rest is background noise. When a narcissist locks onto someone, they will rip off their old skin without blinking. He swears he's done, letting the street run his life. When Serena brings up their enemies, he doesn't flinch. He says they handle it together. He doesn't care about the mob throne anymore. He just wants to rule this tiny bubble with her. Serena kisses him, deeply drunk on his absolute certainty. It looks like a beautiful movie poster, but the life lesson hits hard. You can change your priorities all you want, but your past is a relentless shadow that will never stop hunting you down. Fast forward 6 months, and we see Serena literally planting flowers over the bodies. The compound has become her little fortress of solitude. And wild enough, Kyle is actually keeping his word. He's letting his attack dog, Carlo, handle all the leg breaking while he sleeps peacefully, looking at Serena like she's a literal angel who saved his soul. Even the underworld is playing nice. Marco Bellicaro realizes making money is way better than a gang war. He even sends Serena a fancy first edition book, thanking her for changing the game. Everyone is playing house. But guys, if watching these tragedies has taught me anything, it's this simple life lesson. You can plant the most beautiful flowers you want, but eventually they will rot when the roots are drinking from poisoned soil. Let's open this case file together and look at the cracks forming. Rival bosses start poking Kyle, looking for a soft spot. He just outsources the violence to his muscle, making the killing even colder. And Serena? She adapts. She walks past guys with assault rifles to get coffee and calls it true love. One night, she catches him stressing over a new threat. She asks if he's going back to the streets, and he plays the sensitive husband perfectly. He swears Carlo will handle it, feeding her that toxic line about having no more walls between them. It's total manipulation. The life lesson is brutal, but we all need to hear it. It is terrifyingly easy to confuse a cage for a sanctuary. Just because the guy holding the key keeps telling you that you are perfectly safe. She sits on his desk, trying to soothe his stress. He grabs her hands, playing the devoted husband card. She looks at this absolute apex predator and just sees a wounded bird. The trauma bond is fully baked. Then she drops the nuke. She's pregnant. Kyle totally freezes. His mafia boss mask slips into shock, followed by this twisted version of joy. She uses his own line back on him, whispering about no more walls. He shuts her up with a desperate kiss. But let's be real here. He isn't kissing the love of his life. He's claiming a biological extension of his own ego. The life lesson here hits right in the gut. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, honestly believing that bringing a new life into a toxic disaster will somehow magically cure the poison. He grabs her face and asks if she's happy. Serena admits she's terrified. She lists out the nightmare, the constant gunfire, the enemies, how selfish it is to bring a baby into a war zone. But her survival instincts are completely hijacked, so she says yes anyway. Kyle just gives this sickeningly arrogant smile. He admits their kid will grow up surrounded by snipers and paranoia, but he spins it like a badge of honor. He sells her on the idea that this armed compound is just premium protection. As they hug, they are standing on a ticking time bomb. The tragic life lesson here is undeniable. Love cannot stop a bullet. When you choose to put a romantic filter over your own captivity, you are just condemning your child to grow up locked inside the exact same prison. Watch how these two try to survive their own choices. Kyle immediately spirals into hypervigilance. He's pacing, talking about reinforcing the compound for war. But Serena hits the brakes. She demands he stay in the present, begging him to just be happy. It is wild to watch this ruthless mob boss swallow his paranoia and softly agree. Fast forward 3 years, and their little girl, Elena, is sprinting through that same rose garden without a single fear in her head. She completely bypassed his inherited trauma. The life lesson we pull from this is surprisingly beautiful. Your dark past doesn't actually have to be a life sentence. Sometimes, a stubborn, irrational choice to stay anchored in the present is the absolute only way to break a dark generational curse. Elena is living in a bubble of manufactured innocence. She has zero clue her playground is a mob fortress. Kyle watches her play and stresses that she is getting covered in mud. Serena laughs it off, telling him dirt washes off, but childhood disappears fast. We are watching elite-level psychological compartmentalization here. They playfully arguing about who has to bathe the kid, acting like normal parents. Serena watches her daughter and feels this warm contentment, completely blocking out the fact that her peace was bought with blood. It's absolutely chilling, but the life lesson is as real as it gets. The human brain is terrifying. It will adapt to literally any moral compromise or ethical nightmare, as long as the ultimate reward is feeling completely safe at night. Let's pause the movie right here, because you and I need to look at this supposed happy ending. Kyle is playing the normal dad, spinning little Elena around until she yells, "Papa, again!" He jokes about throwing out his back, and Serena smiles, telling him he is not old. It is painfully sweet. But look at Serena's face. She is tallying up the kidnappings, the blood, the terror, and convincing herself it was just the entrance fee for this afternoon. The bitter irony is that the underworld never leaves your nervous system. You just paint over it with domestic bliss. The lesson here is brutal, but real. We will drag ourselves through absolute hell as long as we believe it eventually buys a safe sanctuary for the people we refuse to lose. I'll watch them build this fortress of fake normalcy. Maria calls out that dinner is ready, playing the maternal anchor. They only invite vetted loyalists like Carlo now. It is a curated isolation, a delusion they desperately need so their brains do not snap from panic. For a few hours, they pretend the blood washed off their hands. But then the camera cuts to later that night. Serena catches Kyle staring out the bedroom window. He is supposedly safe, yet the former kingpin is still scanning the tree line for snipers. It is a massive gut punch. You never really walk away from the war. It teaches us something profound. Real peace is not just the absence of bullets flying. It is a fragile house you have to construct with your own bare hands, brick by heavy brick, every single day. This scene completely flips the script. Serena asks what he is thinking about. Kyle smiles and says he is thinking about how lucky he is and how empty his life would be if she had not called him a coward in that ballroom years ago. She reminds him he would have had his father's empire, but he just shakes his head. He tells her that she and Elena are worth more than any throne. Think about how crazy that is for a guy raised to be a ruthless mob boss. He completely rewired his own dark nature for her. When they say I love you, the irony is knowing exactly how much blood it cost them to get to this soft moment. But the lesson is undeniable. No matter how much damage you carry, or how violent your past is, the human heart never fully loses its capacity for real, genuine connection. Now we hit the most twisted part of the story. Serena is not the helpless damsel anymore. What started out feeling like a hostage situation has morphed into something far more dangerous. She is no longer his weak spot, she is his equal. She finally understands that in their world, love is not a soft feeling, it is a loaded weapon. The minute you find someone you truly care about, your moral boundaries just evaporate. You will gladly orchestrate absolute chaos to keep your family safe. As she leans in to kiss him, you realize she has fully embraced her own shadows, and that is the harsh reality we have to swallow. True resilience is not about keeping your hands clean. Sometimes, to survive the monsters in this life, you just have to learn how to see perfectly in the dark. As the camera pulls back for the final shot, we look down at the courtyard. There is that historic rose garden, still blooming. It was planted by a mob matriarch long before Serena was born. It is the ultimate metaphor. Those flowers survive freezing winters and violent storms, growing in soil literally bought with decades of blood money. Yet somehow, the roots hold tight, and the petals keep opening. It perfectly mirrors how Kyle and Serena turned a horrifying trauma bond into a rock-solid partnership. They fought the entire world, and their own worst demons, just to earn this quiet life. It leaves us with one incredibly stubborn truth. No matter how poisoned the ground is, or how toxic the environment gets around you, genuine human connection will always find a way to firmly take root.
Kyle's fascination with Serena is romantic and writing at the same time. He sends roses, gifts, rare books, and messages. He learns details about her life that she never shared with him. He watches her, follows her, and enters her world with the certainty of a man used to taking what he wants. At first, this attention can feel seductive because Serena has spent much of her life feeling ordinary and unseen. Kyle makes her feel special, chosen, and protected. But the educational lesson is that intensity alone is not proof of love. Obsession can look like romance when it is wrapped in expensive gifts and poetic words. Kyle's behavior crosses boundaries long before Serena fully admits her attraction to him. He corners her after work, has his men approach her, discovers where she lives, and refuses to leave her alone even when she asks. These actions may be presented dramatically, but they raise an important real-life warning. Love should respect consent. A person who truly cares should not treat persistence as a substitute for permission. Serena's confusion is understandable because Kyle also protects her from real danger and shows genuine vulnerability. That complexity makes the story more educational. People are rarely only one thing. Kyle can be protective and controlling, sincere and invasive, loving and dangerous. Viewers should learn to ask difficult questions. Does this person respect my no? Do they give me space? Do they make me feel free? Or do they slowly make my world smaller? A healthy love should not require fear as proof of passion. Serena's journey teaches that being desired is not the same as being respected. A relationship becomes safe only when attraction is joined with boundaries, honesty, and choice.